Our first distinguished speaker is Professor Gautam Bhan, Associate Dean at the School of Human Development at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Echoing Dr. Huck's commitments, Dr. Bhan will be sharing insights on affordable, sustainable, and inclusive housing and land policy. We're also pleased to share that Dr. Bhan's latest book, titled Cities Rethought, A New Urban Disposition, is available right outside the Shantiniketan auditorium for all those who are interested in deepening their understanding of urban governance. And for now, please join us in welcoming him on the stage.
Good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here, and my thanks to the ILDC for this invitation to address you. I'll get straight to it. So I've been asked today to speak about the question of affordable housing. And I'm going to speak about it in the place that I know something about, which is urban India and its cities. I'll do something very simple. I want to offer you 3 elements in which to think about the question of affordable housing, offer a set of practices, not in too much detail, in the ways I think we should move forward, and leave you with one provocation of a realization that I have been coming to, which will, I can tell you now, seem far-fetched, utopian, and idealistic, which is exactly what I want it to be. So the way I want to do this is to take you through very quickly, and I'll just give you one small data point for each of these, affordability. So if you're going to think about this, I want to take us through actually what the status of urban housing markets in India are, before I tell you what we should do about them. I'm going to call this story 11 and 6.5. Okay? I want you to just track just these 2 numbers with me. If you look at the Ministry of Housing's record of how costly a house can someone afford, we have one very useful ratio. It came to us from Deepak Parekh, founder of HDFC Bank, who was chairing the ministry's committee on set, give us a metric for affordability. They said something very simple. And by the way, if you ever apply to a bank for a home loan in India, this is how they judge whether to give it to you or not. 1:5. Every household can afford or should afford a house that is 5 times their annual income. If you make more than that, it takes too much out of you, you'll default on your loan, you won't be able to use your assets, right? So if you make 1 lakh annual household income, 5 lakhs is the maximum part of your house. So the first story simply is, if it's affordable housing, what is the measure of affordability, right? You can talk to any single person in India and they will tell you, no matter where they live, that they cannot afford the house they want. Not all of that affordability is a housing policy problem. So how much money do Indians make? And what is the housing stock that should exist in our cities? Here's the number. So what you're seeing on the left is household income for people in million-plus cities, okay? I just want you to see this, million-plus cities. So these are our biggest cities, our richest cities. This is the best-case scenario for affordability, okay? I'll do the maths for you myself. 2 numbers. 8 of every 10 Indians make less than 2.2 lakh annual household income, which means they can't afford a house more than 11 lakhs. 4 of every 10 urban Indians in million-plus cities cannot afford a house more than 6.5, hence the story, 11 and 6.5. I want you to take 1 minute and think of the city where you came from and imagine the house you will get for less than 6.5 lakhs. Imagine what it's made of. Imagine what the census would call material of roof and wall and tile. Imagine where it is in the city. Now imagine 11 lakhs. Now imagine every real estate hoarding you will see from now to Pune airport or railway station, and think about the cost of that house, right? You don't have to take my word for it. Every market analysis, this is Monitor Inclusive Markets, tells us, just look at the top line, 7.5% of Indian urban households engage in the real estate market. The bottom 62% cannot enter the real estate market, right? By the way, this is a very good way to do if you do consulting, which is that note that the bar width of 7.5 and 62 is the same, when actually it's a 7.2 should be a thin sliver. If one of my students gave this to me, I would fail them in Statistics 101, but it's clever. You can ask McKinsey, they tell you the same thing. One of the big things is that if the story is about 6.5 lakhs and the story is about 11 lakhs, all our policy is here. The Reserve Bank of India's definition of priority sector lending for affordable housing includes all houses up to 50 lakhs. Okay? Any kind of measure that thinks about affordability is on the right side of the spectrum. The people are on the left side of the spectrum. I promise you that's a left and right geographical analogy and not a political one. So, second, adequacy. If you cannot afford the house, then where do Indians live? This is the second story. Two compromises. If you cannot afford to enter the proper formal legal market, you have to make two compromises. The first compromise is on the legality of your house. Okay? And I just want you, so now start imagining that under 6 lakh house, and I know many of you imagined it in either an informal settlement or an urban village or a peripheral area or a slum. That's exactly where it is. Right? So when you look at this, just pay attention to this number. Best estimations, no more than 50% of India's housing stock is formal. Everything else has some tension with the logics of property, titling, land, or law, which means every one of our cities is full of words that seem so normal to us. Unauthorized colony, informal settlement, JJ cluster, irregular layout, irregular subdivision, NA. These words that we internalize and don't realize that what they tell us is that half of all our housing compromises on its legality, which means it is vulnerable to eviction, vulnerable to demolition, which means that even if you don't worry about the bulldozer showing up at your house, you will not put your money to invest in it. You will not improve it. You will not rely on it as an asset. Because, as brokers in Delhi will tell you, sir, is ghar mein na bank ka loan nahi charta, which is exactly how to find out where an unauthorized colony is. Right? So I want you to think about the first compromise. The second compromise, you know, it's on the actual house. And I'm going to run you through a series of images right now because they're familiar to you. Just look at the way our housing stock looks. And what I want to suggest to you is that it doesn't just look that way because people don't have the money. It's because they cannot spend that money because they have compromised on the legality and formality of their house. Whether they live here, or here, or here, or here, or here. They get better, but they're still always in tension. Or here, or here, or here, or here, or here. Because at the end of the day, this is our housing. Multiple types, endless typologies, and every one of them is inadequate in one way or the other. Just look at the 3 columns. Do they have tenure? Yes, no, mixed, maybe. Didn't have at the beginning but got it later. Have khata A but not B. Have a license but not a lease. Have registry papers but cannot. Have power of attorney. Have something that's always not right in the file, right? Do they have services? Yes, no, mixed. Again, why? Because a water utility does not legally put an individual water tap in an illegal colony. Pani Hak Samiti versus Government of Maharashtra. Right? You think about the services where underground drainage cannot be put in an unauthorized colony. So the fact of where services break in our housing is linked to the fact that spatial illegality breaks our infrastructure. It is not just questions of engineering or costs or investment or planning. It is questions of the fact that the second compromise in a broken housing market doesn't just break our homes, it breaks our infrastructure networks. Right? And therefore, on the third side, which is the only thing we ever talk about, right, which is the actual dwelling unit of the house, those inadequacies follow. And it is only by compromising on inadequacy that you can make up for the barrier of affordability. So the Government of India report, headed by the Kundu Committee, had one very good line about India's housing question. And they said something very simple. They said, in urban India, affordable housing is inadequate, adequate housing is unaffordable. One line. Affordable housing is inadequate, adequate housing is unaffordable. You have to compromise on one or the other. Our housing question is about tales of trade-offs that working households make in order to be in the city. Right? And the last trade-off they make is on the land footprint of that housing. This is a slum map of Delhi. It maps between 670 and 750, every informal settlement in the city, to tell you that all of them together, which is about 15 to 25% of the city's population, live on 0.5% of the city's land. Half. Not 1, not 5, not 10, half. Okay? You may have lots of thought about proportionate justice and how much land can be redistributed. But I wager there is nobody in this room who believes that 20% of the city should live on 0.5% of the city's land. Right? And that's the third tacit compromise, that inadequacy concentrates in housing forms that no one should have to live in. Okay? The third story is the story of viability. Okay? Viability is the distinction between houses not being housing. Every single person, the migration panels before lunch, who comes to the city does not come for quality housing. They come for work. And they will choose housing that gives them proximity to work every single time. So that's my third story, the story of duri and paas hona, proximity. The question of the link between livelihood location and housing location. Real estate folks are very fond of saying location, location, location. Workers also say location, 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 but with a different ethic. Because in order to be close to work, they compromise on the adequacy of their housing. They compromise on the legality of their housing, which means that it is not enough to give the best, most affordable, most adequate house at the edge of the city 25 kilometers from work. Because if you do, this is what happens. Just look at the numbers. Just one snapshot. You can look at it anywhere else. Look at the last row. For all slum rehabilitation buildings built in peripheral locations, the abandonment rate was 70%. And you have every single time heard policymakers ask this question, we're giving pakka housing, we're giving affordable housing, we're giving legal housing. Why are the housing policy facts either vacant or abandoned? It is because housing that is not viable, that is not proximate to work, is not housing that people can actually live in. So these three things, this framework of affordability, adequacy, viability, this is our housing question. And the thing to realize about this question is that they are and conditions and not or conditions. If it is affordable and adequate but not viable, it fails. That's your peripheral pakka resettlement colony. If it's affordable and viable, which is the inner city slum located right next to work, it will fail on adequacy. If it's adequate and viable, which is the house I live in, it will fail on affordability. And conditions, affordable and adequate and viable. This is one of the reasons why housing policy is so difficult to get right, because we keep trying to fix one of these three, but not all of these three. And the truth is the housing question requires all of these three. And every household is making a trade-off between them. There is no utopic way to get all three together. So what we must struggle with as policymakers, as practitioners, as researchers, is what's the acceptable trade-off? How can I minimize the adequacy drop when affordability goes up? How much adequacy am I willing to give up for viability? How much viability am I willing to give up for affordability? We need, as researchers, to understand that different households make these trade-offs differently. So if you give each set of households a capital housing grant of 5 lakhs, they're all going to spend it differently, not because they're inconsistent or illogical or naive or lack awareness, because they make different trade-offs between affordability, adequacy, and viability. And those trade-offs have to be respected and anticipated, because they're not beneficiaries. They are agents and citizens making decisions for their households, right? So, given this, the last part of what I want to do is to give you a sense of what we've been doing. And I'm first going to give you a list of complaints, because I have the mic, and so I have one right to critique, and then I'm going to give you a set of propositions. So bear with me for a second. What I've tried to show you very briefly, and there are 100 more data points, is that state and market failures in urban India define a broken housing market. There is no way to look away from this. And the reason I say it's a broken housing market is because the affordability, adequacy, viability fights are not just for the income poor, but go all the way up to the 80th percentile of our market. That's why the question of 8 of every 10 matters. We talk about illegality and encroachment and only think of the slum, when the unauthorized colony is exactly the same tension with the law. If 50% of the housing stock is formal, which means half of the people are informal in some ways, people are not on the wrong side of the law. The law is on the wrong side of people. Right? If you think about roti, kapda and makan, you have to mean it. Makan cannot exit stage right while roti and kapda remain social protection and basic needs, and housing becomes a commodity that is only to be turned into real estate. We have to understand the failures of this market. I have neither a deeply pro-state position nor an anti-market position. But I respect markets enough to say that when markets tell me they're not going to reach below 30 lakhs because there's no profit margins, we listen to those markets. We don't pretend the market is going to give us the 6.5 lakh house. We don't pretend the market is going to give us the 11 lakh house. Right? And if you ask developers, they would tell you the same thing. So the question then is, how do you act within the broken market? But our problem is that all our policies remain focused on the upper end of affordability. Our definitions of affordable housing on this PMAY, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, beneficiary applications start at 3 lakhs annual household income, 15 lakhs. They go up to 6 lakhs, which is 30 lakhs. It's not 6.5 and 11. It's 15 and 30. And this is our housing for all mission. And so when you get the SMS on your phone, PMAY Yojana ka laabh lijiye, that house is always 27 lakhs, 28 lakhs, 29.99 lakhs. Why? Because 6 into 5 is 30. Because 6 lakhs is the MIG limit. Right? So if you cluster to the upper end of affordability, how are you going to reach 6.5 and 11? That's the question we have to ask. Rent remains unrecognized, unregulated, unsupported. We don't have a national rental housing policy. We have barely incentivized low-income rental, though we know that anywhere between 30 and 45% of our workers live on rent. And they live with the most grievous inadequacies. No contracts, no security, no protections, and utterly miserable housing stock, because they have to take what they can get. Right? We have only just begun to recognize shared worker rental housing and PG housing in law. Right? So rent remains a deeply unrecognized form of housing, which has to be one thing we take seriously, because if the ownership market is broken, rent is going to be your dominant market. The focus in all our policies remain on building new units rather than repairing, regularizing, and upgrading what actually exists today. I cannot emphasize this enough. The other thing the Kundu Committee report said, it gave us a number of housing shortage, 18.98 million units. And it said of those 18.98, 15 were already existing congested housing. Think of that, 15 of 19. It's not endemic homelessness. If people live in inadequate housing, which is affordable to them, reducing that inadequacy is housing policy. And reducing that inadequacy is called upgradation. It's called repair. It's called retrofit. It is a distinction from producing the new 25 square meter, 30 square meter, 40 square meter, 1 BHK, 2 BHK house, which we absolutely must produce. Please don't misunderstand me. But we have to understand the balance between producing new housing and improving existing housing, given that you're trying to reach 8 of every 10 urban Indians. There is no evidence that the best performing state in India can produce enough new housing units to meet our housing shortage. None. There is no reason to believe it is possible. It has to be a balance between repair and upgrade and build and construct. Right now, all we want to do is build and construct. Right? There is the question of maintenance that I will move because of time. The focus remains on units. It seems almost utopic to return the question of land and to remember that the question of housing is the question of wage and the question of housing is the question of land, and I'll come back to this. Location remains absolutely absent in our planning and thought. Affordability seems to be our only criteria of note. So if you look at our housing policy, has to be 30 square meters, has to be this much dimension, this much carpet area, maximum price. Nothing about where it is. and then the repeated viability failures of abandonment return and surprise us. They shouldn't. And while I think that technology and new construction techniques and prefab printing and precast and sustainable materials are absolutely essential, they are good, they must be used, they cannot fix systemic fault lines. Okay? And this is the hill that I will die on very happily. Okay? So, what do we do? In my last minute, upgrade. The Delhi Development Authority in the last 20 years has demolished more homes than it has built. Demolished more homes than it has built. You can debate encroachment, you can debate illegality, but when your housing authority breaks more than it builds, your housing question is not being solved. Evictions can never be a sound answer in a broken housing market, not if roti and kapda are meant to be with makan. Right? Large-scale upgrading, large-scale land titling is the only way forward that works to recognize the housing that already exists but is inadequate. Odisha has just done the Jaga mission. Karnataka has a history of titling from the 80s, so does Andhra, so do many parts of this country. We have not seen it for a while. I was very happy in the new guidelines of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana to see one sentence return: land pattas may be given to slum and landless households for improvement. It's a very good line. It may be the only line to hold on to in the entire document, but it is a direction even to see that everyone's recognizing that we cannot build our way out of this problem. Regulate. We've got to get our regulation to focus on the 11 lakh and below part of affordability and not the 30 lakh, 40 lakh problem. I'm going a bit faster. Redistribute. The question of land redistribution, particularly in non-metropolitan urban India, has to be brought back on the table. It can absolutely be a deep fight. Immediately when I say land redistribution, people think of deep Bombay. Please forget Bombay for 5 minutes. Urban India is not Bombay and not Delhi and not Bangalore. There are places where land redistribution is not the fight we imagine. Right? The point is to get our attention to those non-metropolitan urban futures. Recognize, particularly small p private markets. That's not a typo, but a logic. Really use our ability in planning to think about reserving land that protects the affordability in viable locations. Again, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana 2.0 and 1.0 had the notion of the affordable housing zone. Brazil passed a city statute talking about the zone of special social importance. Without reservation through statutory planning documents, we are never, if we do not take some land off the market, every inch of our cities will be real estate. And there is just no way around that question. And it is not a fault of developers. They are doing exactly their job. It is our job to regulate where they can play and where they cannot. In climate change, we are absolutely ready to talk about the limits of land use by creating prohibited zones to protect environmental marshlands. The same logic should apply to socially important land for affordable housing. If we are able in climate change to talk about taking certain land away from use to protect our climate, why are we not able to think about the same technology of governance for affordability and housing justice? It's the exact same logic. How much land should be used for what? It's at the core of our planning function. Invest. If the market cannot go below 25 lakhs, then state investment has to return to the housing sector. There is no other way to think about this. Right? There is no other way to reach 6.5 and 11. There are two options we have. Either people's wages grow, and I would love to see it. Until they grow, we have to enter into this segment as states. But states not alone. States with new partnerships. The Building and Construction Workers Shelter Fund for Construction Workers has thousands of unspent crore rupees that have never been used for construction workers' housing. Why? Why are there not partnerships with union organizations, with federations, right? With even religious organizations? How do we think about an expanding set of governance networks that deliver on this housing and not leave it to the state alone? How do we return a set of employer responsibility into the question of housing? The center of Bombay and Calcutta of industrial cities were built around affordable housing around the chawls that were linked to employment and were linked with employers, right? Where is the question of employer responsibility for labor in this moment, where we think about that delivery, where people, again, get rights not as beneficiaries, but as workers? And the last is to maintain. So my final slide is to say, this is a tall order. There are many things to do here. I just want to leave the approaches with you to reorient us from questions of focusing on building new units in peripheral locations that are abandoned as a toxic cycle of practice we keep repeating without success, or to return to cycles of forced eviction and demolition that are at the highest that they have been in decades in India. Right? None of these can be the basis of sound housing policy. We have to change our verbs. We have to change our practices. And so the last thought that I have then is, what will make us do this? Because let's be frank, neither the political economy, nor our political culture, nor this moment in our social and political history seems to suggest that we care about this fight. Actually, the extent of our urban inequality has been normalized to such an extent that the fact that 8 of 10 of our countrymen and women live in inadequate housing no longer moves us in our hearts. Something has to shift, a moral and political consciousness. Everything else are things that policy experts can tell you how to do. None of this happens if the politics doesn't change. And so my provocation is this. In 1989, one of the largest countrywide mobilizations for a people's right to housing was spread across unions, across workers. It led to a draft bill whose cover you're seeing. The convening drafting committee of this bill was headed by no less than Justice Krishna Iyer. Then advocates Muralidhar, names you will recognize, Venkat Ramani, names you will recognize, were part of it. Justice Potipati of the Madras High Court was part of it. It got a long way. It spoke of the right to adequate housing. It spoke of a constitutional right in the frame. And in 91-92, had Rajiv Gandhi not been assassinated and the world not changed, we may have been living in a very different country. I am not suggesting to you that rights are magical silver wands that make things happen. But I'm suggesting to you, when you are in a broken system, sometimes it is only a fight for something like a constitutional right to adequate housing that can push us to start fighting the extent of this fight. And perhaps that is where we should begin. Because currently, where we are, it is not just that we don't have a fundamental right to adequate housing in our Constitution. It is that the word housing never appears even once in the Indian Constitution. The word shelter never appears even once in the Indian Constitution, not even in the lovely directive principles of state policy. There is a need for a genuine, structural, radical reimagination of what we owe each other as a society and where housing is. Everything else is a technical answer to a political question. And beyond a point, those of us trained in giving technical answers will tell you that they are not enough. So, in closing, I'll say and return to one of the big philosophers of India's anti-caste movement, Gail Omvit, who talked about utopias in this way. And what she said is that utopias are not idealistic dreams. They are a combination of what she called ecstasy and reason. Ecstasy enough to imagine a different world, but reason enough to actually define pathways to get there. My hope is that this is what we do for housing. Thank you.